You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 35. My name is Sean Wildemuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. On today's show, I have Mike Woodring of Pluralsight. Mike is the VP of Developer Content for Enterprise Software at Pluralsight. He's a former Microsoft C# MVP and a multiple U.S. patent holder. Mike has over 20 years of experience developing high-performance software systems and training developers around the world. Mike is the co-author of Win32 Multi-Threaded Programming and Debugging Windows Programs, Strategies, Tools, and Techniques for Visual C++ Programmers. Of course, I know Mike from both Pluralsight and Developmentor. Mike has a keen mind when it comes to multi-threading, and I was really interested in getting him on the show and seeing how he started. In today's show, we talk with him about Montana, multi-threading applications, as well as his passion for training. Let's take a listen. Well, today on the show, I'd like to welcome Mike Woodring. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sean. Thanks for having me.
So I think of you as being in both Utah and Montana. Do I have that right?
Yes, we live in Montana, and I run down to the Salt Lake City area to Pluralsight's offices on a regular and as-needed basis.
So Salt Lake becomes the big city to you.
Right. Yeah, Salt Lake is a big city.
And you live like on a ranch out in the middle of nowhere. Is that right?
Not anymore. When we first moved to Montana, we bought some land a little bit out of town. That turned out to be logistically challenging for a family with 4 young kids. So, yeah. But we just live in town now.
Oh, okay. That's, and what is the town?
We live in Billings, Montana.
Oh, Billings.
Which is,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, South Central.
For some reason, I thought I might not know or not recognize the name of the town, but yeah, of course, Billings.
It's likely the one city you see on like CNN weather reports every once in a while.
That's funny. And usually when it's incredibly cold.
Incredibly cold or some big storm went through, yeah.
Oh, sure. So you've been in this business for a while. What was that first, computer as a kid? Did you get one when you were a little kid from your parents, or did you start in college?
It started as a kid. My dad was an engineer in the Air Force, and so he was a kind of a techie, and so we always had miscellaneous electronics around the house, and I was always interested in them from an early age. I would say the first actual computer that I recall having around the house that my dad brought home was the Texas Instruments. I think it was a TI 99 4A. It was basically a keyboard with, I don't remember if it had a tape deck as a peripheral, but it didn't have its own monitor. You just attached it to a television. That was your monitor. So I remember that. Yeah.
And was that the one with the chiclet keyboard, or did you get actual keys with that?
It had its own, I'm not sure what it was called, but it had its own keyboard. It basically was like a keyboard. That's what the computer looked like. It was a keyboard with, a little bit of surface area beyond the keys.
And just it opened up into a basic prompt like most of the computers back then?
Yeah, I don't remember a lot about the UI. I do remember we had a tape deck, a classic cassette tape deck that you could use to save off programs or run programs. And that was my first experience with a computer in terms of programming. I remember being introduced to BASIC at that point. I think my crowning achievement at that point was to use to write a program, if you could call it that. If you could see me, I'd have air quotes around the word program. But it played the theme song to the movie Star Wars.
Oh, nice.
Which was basically like 600 lines of calling the same function to ring the speaker at a certain frequency and duration.
And there was the one tone module in those, so you wasn't like polyphonic. It was just a melody.
It was sound, I think was the name of the function, and there were 2 or 3 parameters: the frequency and the duration. And I can't remember if there was another argument of some sort. But yeah, I actually have an old handwritten pencil yellow paper printout somewhere.
Oh, really? Wow, that would be cool to see. So you knew it seemed that you had some inkling that you had a proficiency there as a pretty young kid.
Yeah, it was just always a fascination, and kind of on a broader perspective, I was always fascinated with just machines and how they worked. So I liked to take my toys apart. I was that kid.
Oh yeah, and clearly your father being an engineer, Apple didn't fall far from the tree, so he was pretty encouraging, I would guess.
Yeah, I thought, it later in life when I was in sort of the high school age and I was looking at college, I thought that my interest in that might make me suited to be an electrical engineer, which is originally what I pursued in college. Mm-hmm. But that was based on no more than just thinking electronics were cool.
Sure.
And thinking that was the right degree that matched. So I didn't shift into programming until I was partway through school.
Oh, interesting. And did how did college move you into the first job? Was it a job during college or?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to get an internship following my freshman year. So as a freshman, I was declared as an electrical engineer at Virginia Tech, as it turned out, and the engineering program at Virginia Tech was interesting at the time, in that all of the engineers had to either have a computer or have daily access to a computer and take programming courses.
Sure.
So I was learning Pascal and Fortran as a freshman in college. The summer following my freshman year, I was working for a defense contractor who had just taken delivery of a new flight simulator system that was based on 3D models from AutoCAD and programming done in this, to me at the time, new language of C. And so they were like, well, Mike's the only guy around that knows anything about programming. So I got the old K&R book and taught myself C and fiddled around in this flight simulator world. And that was really what ignited my passion for programming. I realized over the course of that summer job that what I really liked most about the work there was not the other aspects of the job that I had, but it was writing the code and working with the other engineers to develop code to analyze their wind tunnel data or whatever it was they were doing. So that's what made me sort of turn my attention towards degrees and careers related to the programming aspect of working with computers as opposed to the hardware aspects.
Wow! And so, in college at that point, you weren't being taught C. This was just something you had to pick up while you were in the internship.
That's right. Yeah, I spent my summer just learning C and using it at work.
Interesting. And so did you have sort of this fresh perspective when you went back to school the next year? Did you know you were going to be change majors at that point?
It was during that summer that happened. It did not have the best freshman year. I was looking back on my freshman year and thinking about the upcoming sophomore year as I was working at this job and thinking I'm not super excited about going back. I wasn't thrilled with the curriculum I was in. So I ended up and again, it gets back to my dad. I think at one point he asked me the question, well, have you ever thought about computer science, which was a degree I hadn't been that familiar with up to that point. And of course, at the time I hadn't been thinking about it. So I grabbed one of the books from a different school I had looked at during high school. And that was Montana State University out of Bozeman. They had a computer science degree program within the engineering department, which is very well thought of in the Pacific Northwest. And I got to just looking at the descriptions of all the computer science courses that they offered as a part of that degree. And every time I read a description, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. So that's what made me switch my declared major, and I switched schools and never looked back. I had the rest of college for me after that was fantastic. So
awesome.
That was my turning point.
So you knew at that point, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Once I started reading those course descriptions, I was just an epiphany for me. I realized I could actually go to college and spend all day learning about all these things that just interest me anyways. And then to think about getting paid to do that after college at a job was just, I was tickled pink.
So what was your first job out of college?
So, it actually started in college. While I was in Bozeman, I was fortunate to get another internship, this time just year round, not just during the summer,
Sure.
working for a small offshoot company named Extended Systems. It was an offshoot of Hewlett Packard out of Boise, Idaho. And they opened up a small R&D outfit in Bozeman, and they had a couple of full-time engineers, on the software side, a couple on the hardware side, and they were looking for a couple of college kids to work with the double E's and the computer science guys. So I was fortunate enough to get the internship that went for a software developer, and I spent 2.5 years there.
Wow.
While I was finishing school, building software that was part of shipping product.
Wow.
And that was fantastic because it made the career path real for me. It made the school I was taking more interesting because I had that real life application experience, that I could learn about theoretical stuff in school and then, code it up at my day job. So it was wonderful. And I stuck with them after college. So I turned down some job offers at Microsoft to stick around in Bozeman, Montana, which at the time I couldn't envision leaving. It was
Sure.
just a fantastic part of the world to live and work in. So I worked for Extended Systems for about a year out of school, and then ended up moving to Portland and taking a job at Intel as a software engineer.
Oh, that's interesting. So had you grown up in Montana?
No, I didn't. My dad was a career Air Force officer,
So
and he
grew
was
up everywhere.
Yeah, he was from Montana. So as I grew up elsewhere in the U.S., moving around, Montana was always sort of a vacation destination every once in a while to visit, relatives, and was as much a home as any place else I lived. So,
well, that makes sense.
Yeah, I never lived there myself until college.
So Chris Ells has been on the show, and of course he moved to Portland to work at Intel. Did you guys know each other there? Or, I know it's not a small campus, but
we actually did. As it turns out, we both hired into the exact same group, the exact same team at Intel. I think I was there within 6 months after Chris hiring in. So
wow.
Yeah, it was a very, very small world. We both, and that's where we met was at Intel in the Hillsborough campus.
Oh, I had no idea. I knew you guys obviously from Developmentor, but not I didn't know it went as far back as his Intel days. So what was the work like at Intel for you?
Oh, it was great. I had a really good time there. I was there for about 5 years. And at the time, the group that Chris and I were working on some telephony-based products. So we were part of an organization that was actually a product development group as opposed to a research group. And we were building software that was designed or intended to show the usefulness and power of the host platform, the Intel-based typically Microsoft-based PC running DOS or later Windows, so that what work that was being done in sort of add-in cards, like DSP chip-based cards for conferencing, could be done using the host processor. So we were building things related to, initially it was fax-based analog telephony, and then moved on to the network, I think it was H323. It was internet-based protocols, LAN-based protocols for networking, and then video came in later. So we started off just working on just audio and telephony stuff.
Wow. And in those early days, did you obviously you learned a lot in college, but were there early mentors that you sort of changed the way you thought about writing software, and not just technically, but sort of the entire process of software development is sort of an interesting piece, and we tend to focus on the technical side.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I had more. I don't know that I could say I had mentors as far as the practice of being a software engineer. Mm-hmm. Our group was interesting at Intel because it was fairly flat. So we had guys like Chris and myself, which were software engineers, and then we had manager, and the manager wasn't a software engineer. And so we had a lot of we basically decided how to do the job on our own. So we had product goals or development goals, and then we just figured it out. I always tended to have people that I looked at that I thought were doing interesting things. And before the Intel days, that was a guy named Peter Norton. He wrote a lot of PC-based utility software. And it just always fascinated me that he could, what he could make a PC do. And so I was always intrigued by just trying to imitate what I can't even recall the name of a particular utility now, but Peter Norton had a utility that would do something to a computer, and I would sit down and say, how did he do that? And try to figure it out on my own. So
everyone had the Norton tool suites back then.
Yeah,
just like the undelete and the undelete's the only one I ever remember, but
yeah, and TSRs. I mean, it was I think the first piece of software ever used on a DOS based PC platform that you could run a program and it would exit, but it wouldn't really exit. Right. So, TSRs would terminate and stay resident, so that the idea of being able to use an application like a word processor, but at the same time having this other thing running in the background just fascinated me. And that was actually, probably the germ of my longstanding interest in, concurrency and threading and those types of topics.
Sure. I'm sure there's some people listening to the show who grew up in a Windows or OS 9 or OS 10 world, that the idea of two programs running at once is just, of course, why would they
Right.
not? What do you mean something couldn't be running in the background? And of course, back in the DOS days, they had to do a lot of tricks to make that work.
That's right. Yeah. One old time, I think it was a blog post I wrote a long time ago, was titled "When I Was a Boy, Threads Were Called Interrupts," and it sort of captured that notion of being an old guy and dealing with the days when the idea of having something, more than one thing running concurrently was sort of this new shiny thing to be learned about. So,
and required hardware.
And yeah, it did. Yeah. Which of course at Intel, that was our job, was
their thing.
We used to joke our job was to write slow software because we were trying to push the limits of the computer to demonstrate the power of the computer, but at the same time create demand for buying that next generation processor to get more speed, more power. That's
interesting. Now, in that part of your career, were you primarily a C++ guy?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, C++, some device driver work, VXDs, I think they were called prior to the NT-based OSs. Right. So VXDs, and then Windows NT device drivers, and then the user mode code just sort of above that, up below the UI. I was always, I was not the guy you wanted writing any code that was responsible for making an application actually look shiny and pretty. That was never my forte.
And did you find an affinity to certain languages, or was this I find there's a number of different kinds of developers, obviously, but there's some that are very passionate and get deep into the language that they sort of feel like is the one that they want to do all their work in, no matter what they do. And then there's other guys that, think about language as merely a tool, and every language you pick up can teach you more about other languages and that sort of thing. And where do you kind of sit in there around languages?
I probably have a foot in both worlds. I'm generally just a language person. I'm intrigued by how languages work and the different approaches to dealing with syntax and semantics. And in school and in some of the work I did at Intel, I was always interested in compilers as a technology. Yeah. So, but professionally, because of the nature of the work I was working in, I tended to fall into being primarily at the time, C and assembly language, and then C++ was a fascination for me. And I did a lot of work in C++, both as a developer and as a teacher and a book author. And so kind of naturally gravitated into C#. So those were the primary languages for me getting my work done. And then just enjoyed tinkering on the side. So
because you're someone who, thinks and loves this idea of threads and threading and all that, when you look at sort of what we have today with, the different languages handle it in different ways, but lambdas and async and await, and, when you think back to having to deal with, threading even 10 years ago, do you think we're in a better place now? It's certainly easier to do, but do you think developers sort of miss something around really understanding how an actual thread works in an OS?
Yeah, that's a decent question, Sean. I think we're still in a transition period. I knowing what I know about the difficulties of writing code to take advantage of things like concurrency and still have that code run correctly, I yearn for the days where we've got language level support that makes it possible to accomplish the sort of the business goals of the development activity without incurring dangers. So I'm very much attracted to the promise of functional programming languages as a possible solution to that. I'm not quite sure we're there yet. So we still see a lot of things nowadays that are things like async and await that are designed they're a step in the right direction, right? So for the C# developer, it's helpful to be able to leverage those kinds of features to tap into the power of the platform in a way that's somewhat less error prone. But I think we're still we're not quite there. We're not quite to the ideal world, I think, where we all want to be. So it's not without its problems and difficulties for the developer who, having written the code that was easy to write, is now faced with the challenges of debugging it when something isn't working, which can still be challenging. So combination of language and tooling will help. But I think that's where other languages that and concepts like immutability are really going to help get us over the hump here.
Yeah. Now let's talk about that, because I hear this talked a lot about when people talk about problems with concurrency. But the nature of a lot of business applications is they are nothing but state change. And so do you think immutability, regardless of language, is something that a lot of developers should really understand when they're talking about concurrency? Or do you think there's more to it? I wrote a lot of concurrent code back in the day where you really had to, pre-thread pooling, where you were really firing up your own threads, monitoring them, communicating from thread to thread with thread local storage, all of that stuff that was tough. And so certainly the newer tools are attractive, but the newer tools don't seem to solve the essential problem is how do you keep them from, destroying each other's data?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for you, Sean. I think that it's going to be solved or at least greatly facilitated by a combination of language features that help us avoid pitfalls and embrace power, and a little bit on the tooling front as well, but also sort of just different ways of thinking about breaking problems down. I think it gets back to the design phase. I remember when I was taking some graduate level courses on distributed computing, and somebody at one point said to me, I think at one point I read a paper, and they were talking, it was distributed computing. So it was about getting lots of machines on a network to cooperate to solve a problem. And in the context of shared data, there was this moment where I was reading this article and it was talking about, instead of having multiple threads touch this piece of data or write this piece of data to disk or synchronize on this piece of data, it was just talking about being faster to just ship that data, ship that object, which is not the word they were using, but
sure,
just send it to another machine, because it was faster to send it across a network and let another machine hold it than it was to write it out to disk at the time and then bring it back in. And for me, that was just an epiphany in terms of thinking about a problem in a totally different way than I had been thinking about it. And I think in the case of concurrency and trying to manage or synchronize two different entities of some sort, whether it's machines or threads, touch the same piece of data, I think that's going to be helped by different abstractions where the database is taking care of sort of holding the data or distributing the data or caching the data, and programmers that are just going about breaking down the problem in a different way. So instead of designing I want this thing and I want multiple people to touch it, just thinking differently in terms of shipping around messages and dealing with responses and having a game plan up front for what happens if two people send a message to a certain endpoint somewhere, both with the intention of causing a change in state and just having the awareness that you might not be first to make that request. And so concepts like versioning of objects comes into play. And that gets back to the paper I was mentioning where, you could sort of optimistically just go for it and let some other piece of the system just come back with you and say, well, you know what, we can't make your change because the object now has this state, and just giving it back to you as a copy. So everything was, copies of data flying around, and there was no direct manipulation in terms of shared state like we think of it now.
And so if I hear what you're saying, the idea would be that at some point in the process, you would take all these changes and then just try to do the accounting of it to get back to what is really the mixed state. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So let's, I think of you more from sort of the developmentor and certainly the Pluralsight days. And so that transition into, more of the training and teaching, where did that come from?
That started in college and just out of college when I was taking some graduate courses and working as a GTA. I just found myself for the first time in my life teaching about programming to people. Started as teaching my classmates, so to speak, or undergrads. When I was at Intel, and Chris would tell you the same thing, our group was awesome for lunch and learns. We were always just meeting over lunch and sharing what we had just read in this book on, writing code a certain way, or what we just learned about this language, C++, or what we just discovered in terms of threading in the Win32 API. So very early in my college and the professional career, I just happened to find myself sharing what I had learned about some technical thing with other people that had similar interests. At some point during my work at Intel, there was an internal conference I don't remember overall what the conference was about, but there was a talk that somebody was slated to do on a COM-based technology called at the time Active Movie, which is sort of a graph-based approach to stitching together codecs to encode and decode audio and video. And somebody asked me if I could take over, fill in, as a replacement speaker for somebody, which I did, and that's kind of sort of made me realize there was even a different style of teaching out there. And as I kind of sort of waned down or kind of concluded my career at Intel, I had been thinking for personal reasons about leaving Intel in order to get the family, back to Montana. My wife and I were looking at, ways we could get to Montana. It wasn't going to happen because Intel was going to open an office anywhere in Montana. So I was, thinking about other careers, and at the time I'd worked on some books as an author. We'd had training people come in. I'd brought in groups of, or individuals to teach my team about device drivers or Win32 or whatever the technologies were. And there was a developmentor guy we had brought in named Ron Samita. And I remember sitting there thinking the whole time I'm watching him teach this class to my team, like, what a great job he has. He gets to travel around and he gets to teach cool things to other developers, and he's very technical. And then he's done. He goes back home at the end of the week, and what a great job that seemed like. So, fast forward about a year, I had asked Ron to be a technical reviewer on a threading book I was working on at the time. And so I kept up a correspondence with him. And that was kind of how I decided that, teaching professionally might be a way to stay close to the technology in a hands-on way. About 5 years into Intel, I was already starting to feel the pressure to manage more than code, so to speak. And that was something I was not ready to do as a 27-year-old, young. And I didn't think I was old enough to stop doing something with compilers directly. So, that's how I made the break. I left Intel and hung out my shingle as a consultant and started teaching Win32 courses for Developmentor as a result of knowing Ron, and then ended up taking over that course, and then moving on and teaching COM and managing the .NET curriculum there. So that's kind of what started my professional career as a teacher.
And certainly there was this lifestyle change that you wanted. Was there also this sort of charge you get out of teaching of seeing people change and accept and hear the different technologies as you're teaching them?
I don't want to belabor the old teacher saying of I enjoy seeing the light bulb go off, but getting back to being a kid and a tinkerer, I always enjoyed taking things apart, and that kind of translated into always really enjoying, in terms of software, understanding why things failed, how things work, how to fix it. So I was always a big fan of all things related to debugging and diagnostics and crash analysis, and in general just problem solving, not just the problem of building an app that accomplishes a certain goal. And that translated for me very much to the teaching realm, because in that context, again, I'm with an audience of people who are just interested to know what it is I'm there to train them on. And in this case, the problem is that they don't know something, or they don't know how to do something. And the solution is the teaching or the training that, I was going to provide, either via a classroom training or online training. And so, the satisfaction for me from teaching was in both the camaraderie of just interacting and being around people who had an actual interest in the topic, because they were not a captive audience of, say high school kids or elementary kids or even college kids who just had to take this course that I'm teaching. They were professionals that had an interest in, the material I was teaching coming into it, and then helping them get to the end of that training and possess some knowledge or possess some skills that would help them, solve their problems, was just an extension of the interest I've always had in terms of problem solving. So a very satisfying career, and something I've always enjoyed.
And I find it interesting because it's a very different problem space from software. When I started doing training, figuring out how to teach people, there's a lot of software involved in people's heads, but it's a very different kind of software than I'm used to dealing with.
Right.
kind of even the archetypes of students is, I find, a very sort of interesting piece, because I did a lot of early sort of intro to X technology training, and there'd always be one guy in every class that knew it really well. And I kind of was like, well, why are you here?
Right.
And sort of battling his advanced question while we're trying to cover the 101 stuff in the first day and all of that sort of problem was also, an interesting problem that it wasn't just the teaching, it was also the sort of managing people.
Right. Yeah. And for me, that was always an enjoyable aspect of classroom teaching that is missing from the video-based teaching, but that live, on-the-spot question that somebody asks that you maybe even didn't see coming, and the thrill that comes from thinking about it on the spot and being able to ideally come up with a good answer or a good piece of advice. Or in my case, a lot of the time, the questions were intriguing and interesting and off topic, and it became fodder for, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I have an idea of how we can figure it out. And then being able to, jump into a demo or an experiment, and whether that was done right there in the context of that particular training module or just sort of a lunch session or an after hours session, that aspect of it, the unknown question that was really interesting and intriguing was very much part of the job that I enjoyed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I have a question I've been asking the last few people on the show, and I've been getting some interesting answers to it. So I want to ask you as well. If you look back at your career, is there something you would change? Is there a direction, a language, managing those people at Intel? Or are there one of those decisions that you would choose differently, you think?
Well, tongue in cheek, I always say I probably should have learned a little bit more about stock options before I turned down those Microsoft jobs. I remember distinctly sitting in Bozeman, looking out the windows of the mountains to the south, and having a person offer me a couple different jobs and telling me the salary and the options that came along with it. And I said, "You're going to give me Microsoft stock?" And she said, no, we're going to give you the option to purchase the stock. And I was like, oh, well, what's that cost? And she told me what the price was, which was some incredibly high number at the time, like $24 a share. And
sure.
I remember thinking, to myself, what kind of an insult is this to offer a 23-year-old kid the chance to buy a whole bunch of shares for $24? Like, I'm just trying to make rent every month. How is that an offer? So, tongue in cheek, in hindsight, maybe I should have called it, asked for a little time to call him back while I went and did a little research. But no, I don't really have any major moments where I wish I had done something differently, possibly with the exception of finishing graduate school. I was always the kid that I was in a hurry to get done with school. When I was in high school, I couldn't wait to get out and get to college. And when I was in college, I couldn't wait to get out and get to work. Get started on life. And I think in hindsight, and this is advice I'm trying to pass on to my own kids, is just don't be in such a rush, right? Just if it's interesting to you and it's feels worthwhile, don't be in a rush to move on and get to the next level, right? Savor the thing you're working on right now and soak it up for all the experience you can get out of it, and then move on.
Enjoy the moment and then move on. Yeah. Well, I think that is actually great advice. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate the time you spent with us.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It was fun being here.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World podcast